Think carefully. Imagine that the most radical teaching attributed to Jesus was never meant to become a religion, a doctrine, or a moral system, but a precise inner experience. Imagine that behind familiar prayers and repeated words, there once existed a living practice, a silent alignment capable of opening the deepest center of consciousness, a prayer not spoken with the lips, but enacted within awareness itself, a prayer that did not ask, beg, or plead, but remembered. Now imagine something even more unsettling. What if this prayer was deliberately silenced, not because it was false, but because it worked too well? What if it made institutions obsolete, intermediaries unnecessary, and authority irrelevant? And what if tonight, not in some distant future, you could begin to reconnect with what ancient seekers called the monad, the indivisible source of all being? Pense nisso. If the kingdom of God is within you, as Jesus stated, then why has nearly all religious practice been directed outward? Why has prayer been reduced to repetition instead of realization? And why were those who emphasized inner knowledge so often labeled dangerous, heretical, or misguided? Before we go any further, if you are drawn to hidden knowledge, to the exploration of ancient mysteries, to teachings erased, distorted, or forgotten, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video, and write in the comments what you sense while listening. What is revealed here has the potential to change how you understand prayer, consciousness, and your place in the universe. And understand this clearly, the final revelation of this journey is the most powerful of all, because it does not give belief, it gives access. To understand the forbidden prayer, we must first unlearn what prayer has become. In most modern traditions, prayer is transactional. Humans speak, God listens. Requests are made, forgiveness is sought, protection is asked for. But this form of prayer reflects a fractured worldview, one in which the human being is separate from the divine and must reach outward to be heard. In the earliest mystical currents surrounding Jesus, prayer was something entirely different. It was alignment of consciousness, it was union, it was remembrance of an original state before fragmentation. Jesus did not describe God as distant. He spoke of intimacy so profound that he declared himself one with the Father and extended that same possibility to others. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was metaphysical instruction. Non-canonical texts, excluded from later doctrine, portray Jesus not primarily as an object of worship, but as a revealer of inner knowledge. These writings emphasize direct experience of the divine through awareness rather than obedience. Scholar Elaine Pagels demonstrated that early Christian communities were deeply divided between those who taught inner realization and those who emphasized authority, structure, and control. What survived was not necessarily what was most transformative, but what was most governable. Central to this lost understanding is the idea of the monad. In ancient philosophy, the monad represents absolute unity, the source from which all multiplicity emerges. It is not a god among gods, but the ground of existence itself. Long before Christianity, Hermetic and Platonic traditions taught that the soul could consciously reunite with this source through inner stillness and awareness. Now consider the words attributed to Jesus through this lens. When he speaks of light within, of becoming one, of knowing the truth and being set free, these are not moral metaphors. They are descriptions of states of consciousness. The prayer he taught was not about words, but about returning awareness to its source. Jesus repeatedly emphasized silence, secrecy, and inner knowing. He warned against public displays of prayer, instructing instead to enter the inner chamber and close the door. This was not about physical privacy. It was about withdrawing attention from the external world and turning inward. The inner chamber was consciousness itself. From a psychological perspective, Jung understood this deeply. He recognized that religious symbols point toward inner processes. When these symbols are externalized, they lose their power to transform. A prayer that reconnects the individual directly to the source dissolves dependency on authority. It collapses the ego's need for validation. It restores wholeness. This is precisely why such a prayer could not be allowed to spread freely. Institutional power depends on mediation. A person who can access the divine directly cannot be controlled through fear, guilt, or promise. Over time, inner practices were replaced by rituals. Direct knowing was replaced by belief. Awakening was replaced by obedience. Yet fragments remain. In sayings preserved outside official canon, Jesus states that when humans know themselves, they will be known, and they will realize they are children of the living Father. Self-knowledge was not psychology, it was prayer. Awareness itself was the invocation. Ask yourself this: why would silence be discouraged in spiritual practice? Why would inner experience be treated with suspicion? And why do so many people pray constantly, yet feel disconnected, anxious, and spiritually empty? In the next part, we will begin to uncover the structure of this forbidden prayer, how it functions within consciousness, why it was considered dangerous, and how ancient practitioners prepared themselves to engage with it safely. What comes next reveals the mechanism behind its power and explains why it was never meant for crowds, but for those ready to remember. If this stirred something within you, acknowledge it in the comments. Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe and the gods. Attributed to the Delphic tradition, later echoed by Platonic philosophers, imagine now that the prayer Jesus taught was never a sentence, never a formula, never a sequence of sacred words to be repeated mechanically. Imagine instead that it was a precise inner posture of awareness, a way of positioning consciousness so that separation collapses and unity becomes directly felt. This is where most people lose the thread, because they are still searching for something to say, when the true instruction was about something to enter. In ancient spiritual traditions, silence was not absence. Silence was presence intensified. The forbidden prayer begins exactly where language ends. Early mystics understood that words belong to the world of multiplicity, while the monad can only be approached through unity. To speak is to divide. To be silent inwardly is to return. This understanding appears clearly in early philosophical mysticism. Plotinus taught that the soul does not reach the one by movement, effort, or reasoning, but by stillness and simplification. One must withdraw attention from the many and rest in the source of attention itself. This is not metaphor, it is an inner act. And this is where Jesus' hidden instruction aligns perfectly with ancient metaphysics. When Jesus spoke of prayer in secret, of entering the inner room and closing the door, he was describing a withdrawal of attention from sensory identification. The door that must be closed is distraction. The inner room is awareness itself. In that space, there is no petition, because there is no separation. There is only recognition. This is why the prayer was never written clearly. It cannot be written without being distorted. The moment it becomes language, it becomes external. The moment it becomes ritual, it loses its power. The prayer works only when consciousness turns back upon itself and rests in its own source. Early mystical Christianity understood this through direct experience. The text known as the Gospel of Thomas preserves sayings that make no sense to a purely moral or institutional religion. Jesus says that the kingdom is spread out upon the earth, yet people do not see it. Why do they not see it? Because they are looking outward. The prayer was the act of seeing. Elaine Pagels explains that these early communities believed ignorance, not sin, was the true problem. Ignorance of one's divine origin, ignorance of inner unity, and the forbidden prayer directly dissolved this ignorance by restoring awareness to its source. This made it profoundly destabilizing to any system built on external authority. To understand why the prayer opens the monad, you must understand how consciousness normally functions. Most human awareness is fragmented. Attention jumps from thought to emotion to memory to fear. Identity becomes attached to this movement. The sense of self becomes scattered. The forbidden prayer reverses this fragmentation by gathering attention inward, not toward an object, but toward the awareness that perceives all objects. This act of inner recollection was known in many traditions. In Hermetic writings, it was called returning to the one. In Neoplatonism, it was called the ascent of the soul. In early Christian mysticism, it was called prayer without ceasing, not because one is always speaking, but because one is always remembering. Carl Jung later described this psychologically as individuation, the integration of consciousness around a central point. But for the ancients, this central point was not merely psychological. It was ontological. It was the monad itself reflected within the soul. Now consider how dangerous this becomes to institutional religion. A person who can rest in inner stillness and experience unity no longer fears death in the same way. They are less susceptible to guilt manipulation. They do not require constant reassurance from authority. Their morality arises naturally from wholeness rather than commandment. Such a person cannot be easily controlled. This explains why mystical prayer was gradually replaced by repetitive formulas. Instead of inner silence, words were emphasized. Instead of awareness, belief was demanded. Instead of experience, obedience was rewarded. Over generations, the original practice faded, surviving only in fragments among monks, mystics, and so-called heretics. Yet the mechanism remains intact because it is built into consciousness itself. The prayer does not need permission. It does not require initiation. It requires sincerity, stillness, and the courage to turn inward without expectation. That is why it is said to open the monad, not because it creates something new, but because it removes what was never real. Ask yourself now, when was the last time you were truly silent inwardly? Not distracted silence, but alert stillness. Not waiting silence, but present silence. And ask yourself why this is so rarely taught, despite being so simple. In the next part, we will go deeper into how ancient practitioners prepared themselves for this prayer, why misuse was considered dangerous, and what internal obstacles prevent most people from experiencing its effect. What comes next reveals why this practice was never meant to be casual, and why it transforms those who persist. Silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything, attributed to ancient mystical tradition. At this point, it becomes essential to understand why the forbidden prayer was never taught casually, and why ancient practitioners approached it with preparation, reverence, and caution. This was not because the prayer was dangerous in itself, but because it dismantles illusions that most people unconsciously depend on for psychological stability. When awareness turns inward and rests in its own source, false identities begin to dissolve, and not everyone is ready to experience that collapse. In early mystical schools, whether Hermetic, Platonic, or Christian, inner practices were always preceded by purification. This did not mean moral perfection in the modern sense. It meant clarification of attention. Practitioners were taught to observe their thoughts, emotions, and impulses without identifying with them. This created an inner distance, a sacred space in which the prayer could unfold naturally. Origen of Alexandria taught that scripture itself had multiple layers and that the deepest truths were not meant for literal interpretation. According to him, spiritual understanding required inner transformation, not intellectual agreement. The forbidden prayer belonged to this inner layer. Without preparation, it could be misunderstood, trivialized, or feared. One of the greatest obstacles to this prayer is expectation. The mind wants visions, sensations, or dramatic experiences. But the monad is not an object to be experienced. It is the ground of all experience. When attention rests there, the ego feels threatened because it cannot survive without movement, comparison, and narrative. This is why many abandon the practice prematurely, concluding that nothing is happening, when in truth everything essential is happening beneath the surface. Ancient practitioners warned that forcing the practice could lead to imbalance, not because the prayer harms, but because resistance creates tension. The prayer is not an act of will, it is an act of surrender. Awareness relaxes back into itself, effort dissolves, control fades. What remains is simple presence. This is echoed in the teachings of Meister Eckhart, who spoke of a divine ground within the soul that can only be known through letting go. He insisted that God is not found through effort, but through emptiness. This emptiness was not nihilism, it was openness. It was the same inner chamber Jesus pointed toward. When practiced correctly, the forbidden prayer produces subtle but profound shifts. Fear begins to loosen its grip. Compulsive thinking softens. Quiet clarity emerges, not imposed but revealed. Over time, this clarity reorganizes the psyche. Decisions become simpler. Moral action arises spontaneously, not from rules, but from coherence. This explains why ancient communities considered the practice sacred and private. Once tasted, it cannot be untasted. And once integrated, it changes how a person relates to power, authority, and identity. The practitioner no longer seeks salvation as a future reward. Salvation becomes a present realization. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with Jung's observation that wholeness arises when consciousness integrates its unconscious contents. But in mystical terms, this integration is more than psychological. It is ontological. It is the reunification of the fragment with the source. Now consider how this contrasts with modern religious conditioning. Many are taught to distrust inner experience, to fear silence, to seek validation externally. Yet the forbidden prayer requires the opposite. It asks for trust in awareness itself. It asks for courage to remain present without support structures. Ask yourself honestly, what arises in you when nothing is happening? Do you feel peace or discomfort? Do you feel grounded or restless? These reactions reveal precisely where preparation is needed. The prayer does not judge, it reveals. In the final part, we will bring everything together. You will understand how this prayer can be approached tonight, not as a technique but as a state. You will see why it was silenced, why it survived in fragments, and why its power has never diminished. What comes next completes the circle and fulfills the promise made at the beginning. Be still and know that I am God. Attributed to the Psalms, echoed by countless mystics across centuries, now everything converges. What has been hinted at, protected, fragmented and misunderstood, can finally be seen as a single movement of awareness. The forbidden prayer Jesus taught was never an act performed at a specific hour, nor a ritual reserved for the worthy. It was a state of being that could be entered at any moment, including tonight, because it is not added to life, it is uncovered beneath it. The final secret is this: the prayer does not open the monad by reaching upward. It opens it by ceasing to reach at all. The moment awareness stops searching for God as an object, God is revealed as the very field in which awareness exists. This is why Jesus could say that the Father and he were one, and yet invite others into the same unity. He was not claiming exclusivity, he was describing realization. This realization terrified institutions because it dissolves the illusion of separation on which control depends. When a human being directly experiences unity, fear loses its primary weapon. Death is no longer an absolute threat. Judgment loses its grip. External authority becomes secondary to inner coherence. Such a person cannot be ruled by promises or punishments because their center is no longer external. This is why the prayer was reframed over time. Silence was replaced with speech. Awareness was replaced with belief. Inner knowing was replaced with doctrine. The mystical Christ became distant, elevated, unreachable, while the living practice quietly disappeared from collective memory. Yet it never truly vanished, because it is inseparable from consciousness itself. In the desert traditions, among early monks and hermits, fragments of this prayer survived as contemplative stillness. In Eastern Christianity, it survived as inner watchfulness. In Western mysticism, it appeared in the writings of those who spoke carefully, often cryptically, to avoid persecution. The language changed, but the essence remained untouched. What makes this prayer forbidden is not its complexity, but its simplicity. There is nothing to buy, nothing to join, nothing to confess. There is only the willingness to be present without narrative. This threatens every system built on dependence. To approach it tonight, the instruction is not procedural, because procedures belong to the mind. Instead, notice this: sit, stand, or lie down. Allow the body to be as it is. Let thoughts arise without resistance. Do not follow them. Do not fight them. Simply notice the awareness in which they appear. Then gently rest attention not on the thoughts, but on the noticing itself. At first, the mind will attempt to reclaim control. It will comment, evaluate, doubt. This is normal. Do not engage. Each time return to the sense of being aware, not aware of something, aware as such. This is the inner chamber. This is the door closed to the world. Nothing dramatic may happen. That is a sign you are close. The ego seeks fireworks. The monad reveals itself as stillness, clarity, and quiet fullness. Over time, this stillness begins to permeate daily life. Reactions soften. Compassion arises naturally. Insight emerges without force. This is why ancient teachers warned against misuse. If approached as a tool for power, it collapses. If approached as entertainment, it evaporates. It opens only to sincerity. It responds only to humility. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. From the perspective of this prayer, becoming is not accumulation, it is subtraction. What falls away are false identities, inherited fears, and borrowed beliefs. What remains is simple presence. Jesus did not silence this prayer, humans did, and yet it cannot be destroyed, because it is not contained in texts, it is embedded in consciousness itself. Every time someone turns inward with honesty and stillness, the lineage continues. Now ask yourself this final question, not intellectually, but inwardly. What if the divine you have been seeking has been looking through your eyes all along? What if prayer was never meant to reach God, but to realize you have never been separate? If this understanding resonated, share what you felt, not what you thought. Awareness recognizes awareness. And remember, nothing here requires belief, only presence. Thanks for looking.